Marcus Hall had moved to Lakeview Grove with a quiet hope for a peaceful life. The suburban enclave boasted neat sidewalks, yards dotted with rosebushes, and a homeowners association that prided itself on community spirit. While the neighborhood appeared inviting at first glance, Marcus quickly noticed that he was one of the few African Americans on his street, perhaps in the entire subdivision. At first, the difference in skin color seemed inconsequential. Neighbors waved politely as they drove by in their SUVs, and dog walkers would nod in his direction. But subtle signs of unease soon surfaced. People would occasionally eye Marcus with cautious curiosity, as if wondering what he was doing in their corner of the world. Older couples walking past would stare a beat too long. Some of the children in the area seemed friendly, but their parents kept a watchful eye, ushering them along before they could get too close. On most days, Marcus found it easiest to shrug off these small, disquieting moments. He reasoned that such things happened anywhere. Where life offered comfort, it also brought its share of unspoken judgments. In time, he adapted, focusing on his job at a nearby tech firm and spending weekends sprucing up his bungalow's porch and garden. However, one particular neighbor, Evelyn Pike, presented an ongoing source of tension. Middle-aged, outspoken, and apparently keen on establishing her dominance, Evelyn seemed to pay extra attention to Marcus's movements. She lived across the street with her neatly trimmed hedges that contrasted oddly with her invasive behavior. Marcus couldn't go outside to mow his lawn or water his flowers without seeing her peering over from her window or stepping onto her porch to watch. The stares evolved into awkward encounters, and the awkward encounters turned into petty remarks. Evelyn was the type to comment on everything from the brand of mulch Marcus used to the pace at which he brought in his trash cans. She offered unsolicited advice with a tone that implied she questioned whether he truly belonged there. Despite her scrutiny, Marcus tried to maintain a calm, polite demeanor. Still, the sense of being singled out gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the impression that Evelyn viewed him not as a neighbor or even a random acquaintance but as some sort of intruder in her otherwise homogeneous environment. Whenever he locked eyes with her, her expression was a complex blend of suspicion and condescension. Marcus knew that systemic biases often showed themselves in small, insidious ways. Each microaggression was like a drop in a bucket. Alone, it might not raise an alarm, but day by day, it filled the vessel of resentment and frustration. He reminded himself not to let it fester, though. Lakeview Grove was where he hoped to build a future. There had to be a way to coexist, if only people like Evelyn would allow it. Yet, before long, Evelyn's behavior went beyond sidelong glances and offhand comments. She made choices that disregarded boundaries entirely, challenging Marcus in a way that would test both his patience and his principles. Evelyn Pike's first overt act of defiance came in the form of her silver crossover SUV pulling up into Marcus's driveway without warning. The first time it happened, Marcus was inside watching a late-night movie when his doorbell rang. He opened the door to see Evelyn standing there, nonchalantly informing him that she had parked in his driveway because she just needed a spot for a bit. Marcus stared past her at his driveway, where her vehicle sat blocking his own car. He was taken aback, but forced a polite smile. I'd appreciate it if you let me know next time," he managed, not wanting to start a confrontation. Evelyn just waved her hand dismissively and returned to her home. That incident, irritating though it was, felt like an isolated lapse in manners. Marcus tried to let it go. Yet over the next few weeks, Evelyn began repeating the same behavior. She'd pull into his driveway whenever it suited her, as if his property were an extension of hers. Sometimes she'd ring his bell to state her intent, other times she wouldn't even bother. Marcus maintained his yard meticulously. He spent his weekends mowing, edging, and planting seasonal flowers. He found a certain peace in keeping it tidy, a therapeutic act that made him feel rooted in his new community. Evelyn, on the other hand, seemed to pay little mind to her own property's upkeep. Her lawn often looked overgrown, with tall weeds sprouting along the edges of the fence. The incongruity was stark. She let her own space fall into neglect while using Marcus's carefully maintained driveway with brazen entitlement. For months, he tried to brush it off, hoping it was just a neighborly misunderstanding. If he objected too strongly, would she escalate the tension? He had witnessed firsthand how situations involving race and property disputes could spiral uncontrollably. Additionally, there was a faint hope that, given time, she might learn basic respect. Yet his patience wore thin. Each new incident, her car parked at an angle, her hasty excuses when he confronted her, built another layer of frustration. A particularly galling moment came one Sunday morning when he stepped outside to find not only her SUV but also a friend's car occupying his driveway. When he knocked on Evelyn's door, she waved him off as if he were the one intruding. It wasn't that he feared confrontation, he simply didn't want to be labeled the aggressive neighbor. He had seen how racial stereotypes could twist any dispute into a question of character. Marcus was painfully aware of how quickly sympathy could turn against him. So he let it slide, biting his tongue every time he had to walk around an unfamiliar car to reach his front door. Over time, though, the psychological toll became undeniable. This wasn't a case of a one-time courtesy extended to a neighbor in need. It was a pattern, and worse, it seemed deliberate, an unspoken message that she could and would do as she pleased, and that Marcus's ownership of his driveway was secondary to her whims. As the small, corrosive moments piled up, Marcus recognized that he'd have to take a more decisive stand. If Evelyn refused to respect his property boundaries, then he would have to assert them in a way she couldn't ignore. Marcus had mulled over various solutions, polite reminders, a sign reading, private property, even a direct conversation with the homeowners association. None of these ideas felt sufficient, especially after witnessing Evelyn's disregard for every previous request. If talking hadn't worked so far, what was left? The idea for a barrier emerged gradually. Initially, Marcus considered a simple gate with a standard lock. But as his frustration grew, he decided on something more substantial. After researching local ordinances, he discovered that Lakeview Grove allowed homeowners to fence in their driveways so long as the structure didn't encroach on sidewalks or roadways. This meant he could install a heavier, more imposing gate, provided it met height regulations. He contacted a local company specializing in ironwork. The proprietor, a friendly man named Bill, seemed eager to take on the project. Marcus was clear about what he wanted, a tall, wrought iron gate that would leave no room for ambiguity. The top would feature a twist of decorative metalwork, which, if one looked closer, included a row of pointed finials, legal but distinctly discouraging to anyone who might think of climbing over. "Are you sure you want barbed wire, though?" Bill asked skeptically during one of their planning sessions, eyebrows raised. "It's allowed in some parts of the county, but it sure sends a strong message." Marcus paused for a long moment before nodding. "I understand how it comes across," he replied, his voice steady. "But if you knew my situation, you'd see I need something that leaves no room for debate. I've tried talking, I've tried waiting, and I've tried giving the benefit of the doubt. None of it worked." Bill shrugged, taking notes. "Your call. We'll make sure it meets local code. It won't be cheap, but I guarantee nobody will want to mess with it." Over the next couple of weeks, while the components were being fabricated, Marcus wrestled with a mix of emotions. Part of him felt vindicated, finally, there would be a deterrent Evelyn couldn't ignore. Another part wondered if the sheer heaviness of the gate would only escalate tensions. But every time he spotted Evelyn's SUV inching onto his driveway, his resolve hardened. He felt like he had no other choice. When installation day arrived, a small crew arrived with the panels of wrought iron and sets of posts ready to be sunk deep into the ground. The clanging of metal echoed through the street, drawing the attention of several neighbors. Some watched from their windows, curious about what Marcus was doing. True to Marcus's instructions, the crew erected a gate that was visually striking and unmistakably secure. Painted a glossy black, it extended across the full width of his driveway, with a lockable latch on the inside. Near the top, a short but effective coil of barbed wire encircled the decorative points. Its presence was impossible to miss. Marcus felt a surge of relief mingled with apprehension when the work was done. At last, he had a physical boundary marking what was his. For too long, Evelyn's disrespect had chipped away at his sense of ownership and security. Now there stood a literal barrier, one that declared he had the right to protect what he had worked for. He stood on the sidewalk, admiring the craftsmanship, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Well, that's dramatic," came Evelyn's mocking tone. She stood with her arms folded, glaring at the gate as though it had personally offended her. "What are you trying to hide in there? Something you don't want the rest of us to see?" Marcus exhaled, turning to face her. "There's nothing to hide," he said calmly. "I'm just making sure my property rights are respected." Evelyn rolled her eyes, but there was a trace of uncertainty in them. Clearly, the imposing structure rattled her. "I think it's suspicious. Nobody else on this street needs a gate like that." She spat out the words as if they tasted bitter. He met her gaze. "Nobody else here has to worry about their neighbor regularly trespassing on their driveway," he answered, doing his best to maintain composure. For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes darting to the metal barrier that now shut her out. Marcus could almost see the wheels turning in her mind, searching for a retort. Finally, she shook her head and walked back toward her house, muttering under her breath. Marcus watched her go, heart pounding. He couldn't entirely predict how she would react moving forward, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't allow her or anyone else to trample on his dignity again. As he locked the gate for the very first time, it felt symbolic. He was taking control in a way he never had before. He glanced around, noticing other neighbors peeking from behind curtains, some looking surprised, others perhaps a bit sympathetic. But whatever their thoughts, Marcus refused to be intimidated by whispers or sideways glances. He had made his boundaries known, both physically and emotionally, and that knowledge brought him a newfound sense of peace. For a brief spell, the installation of the wrought iron gate seemed to accomplish what Marcus had hoped. Evelyn stopped parking in his driveway. She couldn't, practically speaking, without obtaining the lock combination or gate key. That in itself felt like a victory. He slept more soundly, relishing the newfound control he had over his own property. Yet Marcus's relief was short-lived. One gray afternoon, while he was watering the potted plants on his porch, he saw Evelyn marching down the sidewalk toward him. Her expression was even icier than usual, and she clutched a cell phone in her right hand. Before he could greet her, or brace himself for whatever diatribe she might unleash, she jabbed a finger toward the gate. "I want to know what's going on behind there," she demanded. "People who put barbed wire around their homes usually have something to hide." Her voice carried a note of triumph, as if she were unmasking a master criminal. Marcus lowered the watering can. "There's nothing going on behind it besides my driveway and backyard," he said. "I'm entitled to protect my property, Evelyn." She cocked an eyebrow, her lips curling into a condescending smirk. "And what exactly do you think you're protecting it from? We all know Lakeview Grove is safe. Unless, of course," she let the insinuation hang in the air, eyes narrowing at Marcus. "You're afraid the police might find something if they were to look too closely." He drew a calming breath. He'd dealt with microaggressions in the past, but the direct assumption that he was involved in criminal activity purely because he was a black homeowner behind a secure fence felt like a slap in the face. "My privacy is my own," he managed, voice steady. "And I'm not required to explain my choices to you." Evelyn let out a humorless laugh. "Privacy, huh? More like secrecy. Or maybe you're stashing drugs back there. That would make sense for someone like you." A flush of anger heated Marcus's cheeks. He was poised to respond, but the words died in his throat when he noticed she already had her phone dialed, pressed against her ear. "Hello, 911. "Yes, I need to report suspicious activity," she said loudly, glancing around to ensure anyone nearby could hear. "My neighbor installed a barbed wire fence, and I'm pretty sure he's hiding something illegal, maybe weapons or narcotics." Marcus's heart thudded in his chest. He felt the old fear creeping in, the knowledge that once the police were involved, a simple disagreement could escalate dangerously. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to maintain his composure as he heard her describing him to the emergency operator with carefully chosen words that painted him as a menace. From his porch, he could see a couple of other neighbors stepping outside to see what the commotion was. Their expressions ranged from confusion to concern. Evelyn's voice grew louder. "Yes, it's extremely suspicious. He's acting aggressive and refusing to let anyone see what's behind the fence." Aggressive? Marcus was rooted to the spot, arms at his sides, breathing heavily but otherwise motionless. He realized she was counting on racial bias to boost her claims. If she could convince the operator that he was dangerous, the responding officers might arrive ready for a confrontation. Within minutes, the wail of sirens cut through the suburban quiet. A police cruiser and an SUV pulled up along the curb, and two officers stepped out. Marcus recognized the tension in their postures, the way their hands hovered near their belts. Evelyn hurried to meet them, pointing at Marcus and gesturing theatrically toward the gate. "He just put that up," she said, voice trembling for effect. "I'm scared for the safety of our neighborhood. I've seen suspicious packages and people coming in and out of his driveway at odd hours." Marcus swallowed hard, stepping off his porch carefully, hands visible at his sides. "Officers, my name is Marcus Hall. I own this home. The fence is completely legal, and it was installed because my neighbor," he nodded at Evelyn, "kept trespassing on my driveway." One of the officers, a man with a name tag reading H. Miller, exchanged a glance with his partner. "Sir, mind if we have a look around?" he asked, trying to sound calm but not quite succeeding. Marcus considered his rights. He knew the law granted him the ability to refuse a search without a warrant or probable cause. But he also understood that refusing might inflame the situation. "I'd rather you had a warrant before going through my property," he said, keeping his tone measured. "There's nothing here to see, but I'd like to follow protocol." Evelyn intervened, her voice rising. "See? He's hiding something." Officer Miller pursed his lips. "Let's stay calm. Ma'am, you said you saw suspicious activity. Could you be more specific?" She couldn't offer any details beyond vague assertions. No times, no descriptions, no evidence to back her claim. Meanwhile, Marcus informed them that the gate was recent because of repeated trespassing, not because he had anything illegal to hide. After what felt like an eternity, the officers stepped aside to confer in low voices. Evelyn paced, glaring daggers at Marcus the entire time. Finally, Officer Miller approached them again. "We don't have any probable cause here. We'll file an incident report, but there's no sign of criminal behavior." Evelyn's face twisted in disbelief. "He's probably cleaned up already," she muttered. But the officers weren't swayed. They told her to let them know if she had actual evidence in the future, otherwise, they had no basis to act. Marcus tried to exhale the tension in his chest as the officers departed. They still seemed somewhat wary of him, but they left without taking further action. Evelyn's plan to paint him as a criminal had, for now, fallen flat. Yet the sting of the accusation lingered. It was more than just a neighborly dispute. Evelyn had weaponized stereotypes, calling the police on a hunch that her claims would be believed without proof. As Marcus watched her storm off, he knew this battle was far from over, and the real conflict went deeper than a fence. The squad cars pulled away slowly, leaving Marcus on the curb with a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Despite the officer's relatively quick dismissal of Evelyn's allegations, he was acutely aware of how perilous such encounters could be. A single misunderstanding, a split-second misjudgment, and the evening might have ended in a far more tragic way. Evelyn lingered on the sidewalk, arms folded, her expression taut with frustration. One of the officers, a woman named Johnson, turned back briefly to speak with her. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation from where he stood, but he imagined it involved a warning not to make frivolous 911 calls. Evelyn nodded dismissively, like a child forced to listen to a lecture she had no intention of heeding. Although the police left without any charges, the interaction weighed heavily on Marcus. He felt that, in some subtle way, the officers still looked at him with suspicion. Their questions, simple on the surface, carried an undercurrent that implied he was the problem, not Evelyn. While they did confirm he had the right to erect a gate, they also seemed to hint that he was escalating matters by doing so. Yet, from Marcus's perspective, all he had done was defend his own property against a neighbor who repeatedly trespassed. Neighbors had started gathering, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. A few approached cautiously to ask what had happened. Marcus explained the basics, leaving out the most hurtful aspects, Evelyn's insinuations that he was some kind of criminal, her racial innuendos. He didn't feel like debating it on the sidewalk while adrenaline still coursed through him. To his surprise, more than one neighbor expressed support. A slender older man, Mr. Everett, gently patted Marcus's shoulder. "If you need a witness to how many times she's pulled that stunt with your driveway, I'll back you up," he said, referring to Evelyn's frequent parking. "My wife and I have noticed it for a while. Didn't seem right." Others, however, hovered on the fringes, uncertain. They offered sympathetic nods but avoided meeting Marcus's eyes. Perhaps they struggled to believe that a longtime resident like Evelyn would stoop to baseless accusations. Marcus sensed their discomfort. Challenging prejudice in a tight-knit neighborhood often meant rocking the boat. Some folks simply didn't want to get involved. Later that evening, back inside his home, Marcus realized how drained he felt. The incident replayed in his mind, Evelyn dialing 911 with such ease, describing him as if he were a threat. It reminded him of historical patterns where a single phone call from a white accuser could upend a black person's life. Even in the 21st century, the shadow of those injustices lingered. He decided to document everything. With the help of his phone, he recorded a video statement detailing the altercation. He snapped pictures of the gate, noting the date it was installed, and kept screenshots of text messages he'd exchanged with neighbors about Evelyn's behavior. "If this ever escalates," he reasoned, "I need a clear record of what's actually happening." While reviewing his photos, a sense of quiet determination emerged. He refused to be cowed. If Evelyn believed she could harass him into leaving Lakeview Grove, she was sorely mistaken. He had worked too hard to own this house, to provide a comfortable life for himself, and he wasn't about to let someone's baseless fear or prejudice drive him out. Before going to bed, Marcus scrolled through community forums and local social media groups, half expecting to find a post from Evelyn complaining about him. Instead, he found a handful of vague remarks about unnecessary tension on their street, with no names attached. Some neighbors clearly wanted to discuss it, but no one had laid out the full truth. He typed a measured response on one forum, clarifying that he'd installed a legal gate to prevent repeated unauthorized parking. He added that he believed everyone should respect each other's property rights. Then he pressed send, feeling both anxious and relieved. He didn't accuse Evelyn openly or mention the 911 call. He wanted to present facts, not inflame a digital argument. The next day dawned with a renewed sense of resolve. Evelyn's slanderous accusations had rattled him, but they also spurred him to stand firm. If she intended to keep up this harassment, he would meet her aggression with legal and factual resistance. He considered consulting a lawyer or discussing the matter with the homeowners association. He wasn't sure which route would be most effective, but he knew he needed allies, people who recognized injustice when they saw it. In the back of his mind, he couldn't shake a nagging question: why was Evelyn so intent on undermining him? He suspected something deeper than mere annoyance over a driveway. Perhaps it was a reflection of prejudices rooted well before he'd ever moved to Lakeview Grove. If so, the conflict went beyond property disputes. It touched on the broader issue of how society handles difference and the slow, grinding progress of dismantling racial bias. For now, Marcus braced himself. He had claimed his space, but Evelyn's reaction had shown how far she might go to maintain her perceived control. While the immediate danger had passed, no arrests, no charges, tension remained. Marcus could only hope that time and truth would win out over fear and misrepresentation. Months slipped by with a semblance of uneasy peace. Evelyn no longer parked in Marcus's driveway, that much was certain. But the occasional hostile glare or sudden hush when Marcus stepped outside signaled that rumors still circulated. A few of the neighbors, particularly those close to Evelyn, seemed skittish or standoffish around Marcus, as if they feared he might vindicate her dire predictions of hidden wrongdoing. During this time, Marcus felt a growing urge to dig deeper into Evelyn's background. Something about her brazenness, her willingness to manipulate the justice system with a single phone call, hinted at more than just casual prejudice. Perhaps it was the way she tossed out accusations so cavalierly, accusations that hinged on harmful stereotypes. Or how she acted as though she possessed a God-given right to police his every move. One day, while scrolling through public records online, he decided to look up Evelyn's name. At first, he found mundane details: property tax documents, an old city permit for home renovations, a mention in a local newspaper announcing her family's arrival in Lakeview Grove years ago. But when he dug further, venturing into archived articles and lesser-known sites, a disturbing picture began to emerge. He discovered references to an Evelyn Burke, who had been involved with a group that spouted extremist views. The group's website was long defunct, but archived snapshots displayed a list of active members at one point, and there, in black and white, was the name Evelyn Burke. The coincidence in name and approximate age seemed more than random, and he soon found matching biographical details: birth date, city of origin, even references to her father's involvement in a more notorious organization with a documented history of advocating white supremacist ideologies. Heart-pounding, Marcus delved into genealogical data. He unearthed court records mentioning Evelyn's father, who had once been indicted for hate crimes in a nearby county. Some neighbors had told Marcus that Evelyn's maiden name was indeed Burke, tying the puzzle pieces together neatly. The data was chilling, painting a stark lineage of intolerance. It dawned on Marcus that Evelyn's contempt for him might not be as isolated or spontaneous as he'd initially assumed. It was likely steeped in a family history that had embraced hateful beliefs for generations. The more he read, the colder he felt. Every article or post he uncovered hinted at a lineage of deep-seated prejudice. The notion that Evelyn had inherited, perhaps even actively embraced, those toxic views made their petty parking dispute suddenly seem like a small corner of a much darker canvas. Marcus tried to keep an open mind. People could change, after all. Not everyone is a carbon copy of their parents. But the date stamps on some of these references were not ancient history. One forum post mentioned sightings of Evelyn and other group members at a rally barely a decade ago. Her involvement with extremist rhetoric might not be as far in the past as one would hope. Staring at the computer screen late into the night, Marcus felt a knot in his gut tighten. If Evelyn's hostility was fueled by a worldview that labeled him and others like him as undeserving, less than human, even, then no amount of polite conversation would ever fix the tension between them. She could be playing a longer game, using each microaggression to goad Marcus into a reaction that would validate her skewed beliefs. Eventually, he forced himself to shut down the computer. He lay awake in bed, mind racing with questions about what to do. Should he confront Evelyn? Alert the neighborhood? Inform the homeowners association or even the police about her ties? Instinct told him not to turn a blind eye. If Evelyn was willing to call 911 on him over a gate, what would stop her from escalating further, especially if she felt emboldened by her past? The days that followed found Marcus wrestling with this burden of knowledge. He wanted the rest of Lakeview Grove to understand the depth of Evelyn's animosity and how it might stem from a legacy of bigotry. At the same time, he worried that airing such explosive truths could inflame tensions, potentially placing him in more danger. He was well aware of how quickly hateful individuals could retaliate, especially when they felt cornered. Yet the weight of the secret pressed on him. Every time he saw Evelyn crossing the street or saw her silhouette in her window, he remembered those archived forum posts and old newspaper clippings. He realized, with mounting certainty, that the events unfolding on their little suburban street were part of a broader pattern. This was the face of systemic racism, manifested in day-to-day conflicts that escalated because people like Evelyn believed they could wield power without accountability. Eventually, he decided he had to act. Keeping quiet allowed the problem to fester, and might encourage others like Evelyn to think they could operate in the shadows. If he was to truly safeguard his home and his dignity, he needed to stand up not just for himself, but for anyone else who might become a victim of her inherited hate. Marcus began compiling a digital folder of everything he'd found: screenshots, archived pages, official documents linking Evelyn's father to racist organizations, and references to her own more recent activities. He didn't yet know how he would use it, but he wanted to be ready. If Evelyn tried another stunt or called the police again, he would have more than just words to defend himself. He would have tangible proof of who she really was and how far her bias might extend. Once Marcus had gathered enough evidence to fill an entire folder, he began to see Evelyn's actions through a new lens. Her constant meddling, the baseless accusations, none of it was incidental. It was, instead, the product of a worldview shaped by a lineage of prejudice. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was someone raised in an environment that prized exclusion and intimidation. The day he learned of her father's history with a hate group was the same day he found an old interview transcript from a local newspaper. Evelyn's father had once declared, "We'll never let outsiders take over our communities," a chilling statement that made Marcus's presence in Lakeview Grove feel like a direct challenge to their twisted ideology. The more he read, the more he realized that Evelyn's hostility was not simply a matter of personal bias. It was a brick in the larger wall of systemic racism. Empowered by this deeper understanding, Marcus decided it was time for a reckoning. He reached out to a few neighbors he trusted, like Mr. Everett, who had earlier offered to back him up as a witness. Under hushed tones in Mr. Everett's living room, Marcus showed him the documents. Shock etched itself across the older man's face. "Good Lord," he breathed, eyes scanning the details of Evelyn's ties to extremist circles. "I knew she was rude, but I never guessed it ran this deep." They discussed the implications of going public. Should they inform the homeowners association? The local newspaper? Mr. Everett worried about backlash. If Evelyn felt cornered, would she escalate her behavior? But Marcus argued that silence would only give her more power. "It's not about revenge," he said. "It's about letting people know who they're dealing with." Word spread quietly at first. A small circle of neighbors learned what Marcus had discovered, each reacting with some combination of horror and dismay. Some were skeptical. After all, Evelyn had lived in Lakeview Grove for years without a scandal on this level. But the evidence was hard to refute. With each screenshot and article snippet, the truth became unavoidable: Evelyn was linked to a network of hateful ideologies. The final push came on a Saturday morning when Marcus found a spiteful note on his car's windshield. In block letters, it read, "Stop digging or get out." No signature, but the intention was clear. Though he couldn't prove Evelyn wrote it, the timing and the content strongly suggested she, or someone close to her, was behind it. That was the moment Marcus decided to go fully public. He arranged an informal neighborhood meeting by sending out an email invitation to those on the block. The gathering took place in his own front yard, partly to show that he wasn't hiding and partly to emphasize that he felt secure in his right to live where he did. The attendance wasn't huge. Maybe 10 or 12 neighbors showed up, but it included enough respected community members to carry weight. Marcus stood by the gate that had been the focal point of so much controversy. He began by recounting his experiences with Evelyn, the driveway parking, the 911 call, the accusations about contraband. Then, speaking with a calm he barely felt, he laid out the evidence of Evelyn's past affiliations. He had a small stack of printouts, each page documenting some facet of her connection to extremist groups. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One neighbor, Miss Callahan, looked visibly shaken. "I had no idea," she whispered. "Evelyn always seemed so opinionated, but I never thought it went this far." Someone else asked, "Could that be why she's been singling you out?" Marcus nodded. "I believe so. This isn't just about personal animosity. It's the product of a belief system that labels me as an outsider, someone who doesn't belong here." Mr. Everett chimed in to vouch for Marcus's character, mentioning how he'd witnessed Evelyn's trespassing. Another neighbor brought up the time Evelyn had made derogatory remarks about a family of mixed heritage that had briefly rented a house a few streets over. Bit by bit, the pieces fell into place for those gathered. By the time Marcus finished, the group wore the sober expression of people grappling with an ugly truth. They realized that ignoring or downplaying the issue would be a tacit endorsement of Evelyn's conduct. A few pledged to support any formal complaint Marcus decided to file. Others resolved to share the information widely, ensuring that she could no longer masquerade as a harmless busybody. In a final act of transparency, Marcus laid copies of the documents on a folding table, inviting anyone to read them. He made it clear that his goal wasn't to stir up paranoia, he simply wanted accountability. If Evelyn believed she could manipulate the community with fear, Marcus intended to combat that with knowledge. The meeting ended with a collective sense of resolve. People dispersed, clutching printed pages or exchanging phone numbers to remain in contact. Marcus watched them leave, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. He had taken a bold step, one that might provoke a fierce response. Yet, for the first time since moving to Lakeview Grove, he felt he wasn't standing alone. The veil around Evelyn's hate-fueled motivations had been lifted, and it was up to the community to decide what to do with the truth. The fallout from Marcus's public reveal was immediate. Within days, nearly every resident of Lakeview Grove knew that Evelyn had ties to extremist organizations. Reactions varied, some were quietly horrified, others openly denounced her, and a handful remained staunchly loyal to her, believing, or pretending to believe, she was the victim of a smear campaign. Evelyn herself seemed determined to spin the situation to her advantage. She posted long messages in the neighborhood's online forum, denying all accusations and painting Marcus as a troublemaker, bent on ruining her good name. She claimed she had disavowed whatever activities her father had been part of and insisted that she was merely a concerned resident who wanted to ensure Lakeview Grove stayed safe. But the documents Marcus had shared were too concrete to dismiss. Old newspaper clippings, website archives, and even local court records told a story that stretched back decades, involving not just her father but also her own attendance at rallies and fundraisers for groups that openly espoused hateful ideologies. Evelyn's digital footprint, scrubbed as she might have tried to keep it, still bore traces of bigotry. Feeling cornered, Evelyn took her fight to the Homeowners Association, filing a complaint about Marcus's aggressive tactics and claiming his gate was a public eyesore. The HOA convened an emergency session to hear her grievances. Marcus was invited to attend as well, bringing along the evidence he had shared with the neighborhood. The meeting took place in the clubhouse near the main entrance to Lakeview Grove. Usually reserved for ice cream socials and community craft fairs, the airy room now held a tense crowd of onlookers, eager to see how the board would handle the controversy. Evelyn stood before the small panel of HOA board members, recounting her version of events. She waved photos of Marcus's gate, calling it overkill and intentionally divisive. She framed her 911 calls as legitimate concerns, asserting that she had seen strangers coming and going late at night, an accusation Marcus believed she fabricated. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he calmly outlined the timeline: months of unauthorized parking, repeated warnings, and ultimately the decision to install a gate after his requests went ignored. He described the day Evelyn called the police, brandishing her accusations of contraband. Then, with measured composure, he presented the evidence of her extremist affiliations once more. A murmur spread through the room as copies of the documents circulated among the board members. Some neighbors who had not attended Marcus's earlier gathering gasped at seeing the evidence for the first time. Others nodded in recognition, having already seen it. The board members exchanged grim looks. Here were tangible records that contradicted Evelyn's claims of innocence. Evelyn tried to interject, labeling the evidence ancient history, and insisting she had no involvement with those groups anymore. "This is all a personal vendetta," she declared, pointing at Marcus. "He's using my family's past to turn everyone against me." Marcus resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "You accused me of criminal activity without a shred of proof," he countered. I shared public documents that show a pattern of hostility toward people of color. People can decide for themselves what that means. Mr. Rourke, the HOA president, cleared his throat. We're here to determine if there's been any violation of community guidelines, he said, glancing from Evelyn to Marcus. As far as we can tell, Marcus's gate is within regulations. It's not blocking sidewalks or road access, and it meets the height requirements. A middle-aged woman on the board, Ms. Delgado, folded her arms. Evelyn, do you have any proof of the suspicious activity you claim to see? Any photos, timestamps, witness statements? Evelyn looked flustered. I know what I saw, she sputtered. I don't need timestamps to confirm it. But in the court of public opinion, and in the eyes of the HOA, her words rang hollow. With no solid evidence, her claim that Marcus was hiding something fell flat. The board formally concluded that Marcus's gate was permissible and that Evelyn's allegations lacked substantiation. Humiliated but not defeated, Evelyn stalked out of the meeting, refusing to respond to neighbors who tried to question her further. She retreated to her house, slamming the door. Meanwhile, the crowd dispersed, some wearing thoughtful frowns, others exchanging relieved glances. Marcus lingered to thank the board members for their fairness. Ms. Delgado offered a sympathetic pat on his shoulder. I'm sorry you've had to deal with this, she said softly. We take these matters seriously, and we won't let anyone use our association to spread harmful agendas. Keep documenting everything. As he walked home, Marcus felt a wave of gratitude for the handful of community members who had chosen to stand with him. Yet he also knew that Evelyn was unlikely to back down quietly. People with deeply ingrained beliefs seldom changed overnight, especially when cornered. Still, for the moment, Marcus took solace in the fact that he had faced her publicly, armed with the truth, and come out unscathed. Whether Evelyn tried to rally her remaining supporters or pivot to another tactic, Marcus was prepared. He'd shown that he wasn't alone in exposing her bigotry, and, crucially, that Lakeview Grove wasn't entirely willing to ignore the realities of racism within its manicured borders. In the aftermath of the HOA ruling, tensions reached a new peak. Rather than admit defeat, Evelyn doubled down. One weekend afternoon, while Marcus was trimming the shrubs lining his driveway, he heard shouts from across the street. He glanced up to see Evelyn standing on her porch, phone in hand, yelling that he was threatening her with a sharp object, her words for his hedge clippers. Marcus felt a chill run through him. Here it was again, the attempt to paint him as dangerous. Sure enough, Evelyn was already calling 911, her shrill voice audible even from his yard. She claimed that he stood menacingly close to her property line, brandishing a weapon and uttering threats. He closed his eyes for a moment, mustering his composure, then continued trimming. If the police arrived, he wanted them to see him calmly going about his yard work, not panicking. Within minutes, sirens wailed nearby. This time, however, Marcus was better prepared. When the officers pulled up, Evelyn launched into her story of being terrified and cornered. But Marcus calmly presented them with a file of documents, his previous incident reports, the evidence of her extremist ties, and statements from neighbors who had witnessed her harassment. He also had a short recording on his phone, captured earlier that day when Evelyn began shouting, clearly showing he was on his own property, using garden tools in a routine way, and making no threats. The contrast was stark. On one side, Evelyn stood wringing her hands, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as she spun a tale of victimhood. On the other, Marcus methodically laid out evidence that showed a pattern of false allegations. The police looked from him to her, their initial skepticism giving way to realization. After a brief consultation, the lead officer signaled to his partner. They approached Evelyn, calmly explaining that her repeated calls accusing Marcus without valid proof could amount to filing false reports. Eyes widening, she protested, claiming that Marcus's background and mysterious fence justified her suspicions. But the officers, this time, seemed unmoved. Marcus watched with a tense mixture of relief and apprehension as they took Evelyn aside. Words were exchanged, though he couldn't make them out clearly. The conversation ended with the officers placing her in handcuffs, while she continued to protest loudly. It was a surreal sight. Evelyn, once so smug and self-assured, now led to a squad car. Neighbors peered through blinds or stood on porches, witnessing the final unraveling of her attempts to weaponize the system against Marcus. He felt a surge of vindication, but also a pang of sadness for the shattered facade of Lakeview Grove's veneer of unity. Even a quiet suburb could harbor venomous prejudices. Evelyn's arrest sent shockwaves through Lakeview Grove. Word spread quickly. She had been taken into custody for filing false police reports and for actions that hinted at deeper hate-related offenses. During the ensuing legal process, more of her history came to light: her ties to extremist organizations, her father's track record of racially motivated crimes, and various online statements that openly advocated for racist ideologies. The trial that followed wasn't just about a dispute between neighbors. It became a broader examination of how prejudice could fester beneath the polished exterior of suburban life. Marcus took the stand, recounting how her unfounded accusations had escalated to dangerous levels. The prosecution presented the digital archives Marcus had painstakingly compiled, painting a clear picture of Evelyn's manipulative attempts to misuse law enforcement as a weapon against him. Local media covered the case, shining a spotlight on issues of systemic racism. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye found themselves re-evaluating their own biases. Those who'd supported Evelyn realized the extent of her deception and, in many cases, publicly apologized to Marcus for not believing him sooner. It was a humbling moment for the entire community. In the end, the jury delivered a guilty verdict. Evelyn was sentenced for her actions, including her false 911 calls and the intimidation tactics she employed. Marcus watched from the gallery, an odd mix of relief and sorrow rippling through him. Justice was being served, but it came at the cost of publicly confronting the painful truths about hatred ingrained in families and passed down through generations. Lakeview Grove, for its part, seemed determined to heal. The Homeowners Association organized a series of community forums on diversity and inclusion. Neighbors began sharing their own stories of subtle discrimination or overlooked microaggressions, fostering conversations that might never have occurred otherwise. A few even admitted they had once harbored suspicions about Marcus, less blatant than Evelyn's but still rooted in implicit bias. Marcus found solace in these small yet meaningful changes. He tended his garden with renewed tranquility, his gate standing as a symbol not only of property boundaries but also of the boundaries he'd set against intolerance. He realized that, while one court case wouldn't single-handedly dissolve all bigotry, it had at least forced a moment of reckoning in this suburban enclave. In the end, Marcus felt the weight of vindication. He hadn't just protected his rights. He had stood up to a system that often turned a deaf ear to people in his position. Evelyn's downfall revealed the broader, more complicated story of how hatred could hide behind manicured lawns and polite smiles. Yet by confronting it, he and the community of Lakeview Grove had taken steps toward creating a safer, more equitable environment for everyone.